Hello, tennis fans, and welcome to another edition of the OTA's On Tennis podcast series. We're pleased to welcome Irwin Tobias to today's podcast. Irwin is likely known to many of you. He has spent over 60 years in and around the game of tennis, many of them in a professional capacity. He worked for over 38 years at the Mayfair Clubs, one of Canada's first and largest indoor tennis clubs, where he held various roles, including president. More recently, Irwin has been with Tennis Canada, where he has managed Masters tennis since 2012. As well as working in the field, Irwin has also served on many tennis committees over the years, including on the Ontario Tennis Association's board of directors. He was chair of Tennis Canada's Masters Committee for 10 years while working at Mayfair, and is currently serving on the International Tennis Federation's Masters Committee, as well as on the board of the Thornhill Club, where he manages the tennis committee. Welcome, Irwin, and thanks for taking the time to be on the On Tennis podcast.
Thank you, Peter. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I'm sure we're going to find out a lot about the early days of tennis here in the province, of open tennis at least, and looking forward to sort of picking your brain and figuring out, where the game was, where it's going, and that sort of thing. I think it's safe to say that you've immersed yourself in the sport for most of your life.
That's correct, Peter. I've been playing the game since I was 11 years old. Played at a decent level, never really competed, but I was a good club player. I guess you would call me a 4.5. I still play. Up until last week. Played some doubles. Weather's changed a bit, but I enjoy getting out on the court and playing. Nowadays, it's usually just on clay courts.
Yeah, save the body a little bit. I remember. When I first came across you many years ago, I remember you as a tennis in the tennis industry, and I didn't really see you play that often, but I did actually see you a couple of times ago. That guy can actually play a little tennis. He had very nice strokes and all that, so I can understand how you might have sort of gravitated to the sport because you're a decent player. Where did you start? What was your first club? Where did you start playing?
Well, we played at a park. It was Clanton Park.
Oh yeah,
and gave up my baseball glove for a tennis racket. And seriously, the leagues had ended. We reached a certain age, and next thing I know, I was spending my summers all day on the courts at Clanton Park. Enjoyed playing tennis, and there'd be a group of us that played, and we spent the whole day there. It was our summer camp.
Yeah, I'm kind of the same vintage. I remember the same kind of thing where you just get on your bike, go to the club in the morning, your mom packed you lunch, played all day, went home for dinner. So I understand where you come from. So obviously you got a taste for the sport as a young man, and I know you went to York University for your degree here, but then you got into the tennis business pretty well right away. How did you decide it was a career?
Yeah, I actually I have to say I lucked into it. I was working as a summer job at the old Jewish Community Center on Bathurst Street, and I started when I was 16, and it was high school, and it was just a summer job, and then I went to university, and there was a member there that was one of the owners of the Mayfair clubs. And he approached me and said, why don't you come work we just opened a summer club, the Mayfair Valley Club.
Oh, yes.
And he said, why don't you come work for us? So, I said, I felt a little guilty because I grew up at the Y, but, it was time to move on. And so I took a position at the Mayfair Club, the Mayfair Valley Outdoor Club. And of course, when winter came, they asked me to stay on and to work, help them out as a receptionist indoors. So while I was going to university, it was a great gig. I was at Mayfair North, the first club, and then I eventually moved on to Mayfair West, where they asked me to eventually manage the club. This was in the mid-'70s. And so I started as a receptionist and ended up as a president.
Did the whole gamut. Actually, I was a member, and I worked also at Mayfair North, which many people probably don't know because it closed many, many years ago. But Mayfair still has 4 other locations. But I didn't realize you were there, I guess, before my time. But I didn't realize.
Yeah, I worked with Ken Cheeseman at the time and Ed Ferrari, who were legends at Mayfair.
Oh, yes.
And John McManus was one of the pros there.
Right.
It was a great way to spend, and I also was able to play tennis.
Yeah.
Right. Free court time.
That's why I took a job there and with Nick in the cafeteria. But yeah, those were kind of the early days of indoor tennis. Really, it was one of the first clubs. I mean, maybe not the first, but it was certainly one of the early clubs that was built, and it was sort of coincided with what I saw then as kind of the start of the boom, which was mid 70s through to the 80s when tennis became incredibly popular. Clubs, the outdoor seasonal clubs were, when I was growing up, was all there was to play in Thornhill where I lived. But, increasingly more and more indoor clubs popped up, bubbles and permanent structures, and it really took tennis to a new level in this market, at least. And give me your thoughts on that, those early sort of days.
Yeah, certainly. Mayfair started with the North in 1970, and then the outdoor club was built. It opened in 73, the Mayfair Valley Club, and then in 75. I guess word got around that there was another club opening on Chesswood. And of course, the Mayfair group were not too happy because there was going to be competition, and that was the Wingfield Club. I
remember it, yeah.
So they decided, we're going to build across the road, Eaton Simpson's. I don't know if you remember that. So, it was mid-70s.
Yeah.
And, you didn't want anybody to one-up you. So they built, it was 10 courts. And it was a huge facility at the time on Chesswood, across from the Chesswood Arena. And I eventually went there, managed that club for almost 25 years, up until about 2000.
Wow.
So I spent a lot of time, started a family there. My kids took lessons. They grew up at the club. I actually met my wife not really at the club, but I knew her from the club. So it was my life. Mayfair, yeah. I spent a lot of weekends there, met a lot of good people, a lot of pros, bringing back the days with Mike Zimmerman, Bob Bregman, Glenn Ryan was there, Leo Liendo, Rod Bloom. All the guys were just great guys to work with. And the members, I mean, that's what I missed most when I left Mayfair. It was the members and the staff.
Yeah.
Because, it was relationships that you formed. And, it's funny, my wife, when we first got married, whenever we went to a restaurant, she used to say, "How do you know so many people?" And she said, "I know a lot of people, but you know a lot more than I do." And, it's because of the people that I had met at Mayfair.
Yeah. I kind of do think of you as the Godfather of tennis in this community, actually, because you do know just about everybody from multiple generations. So this is why it's so interesting to talk to you. And I think just from what you said there now, and what we've always known is it was a lifestyle. You had a passion for the sport, for the people that were in the sport. It was a job, but it was more than that for you.
Yeah, it was definitely a passion. And one of my, I guess, big passions was running tournaments. I just loved the vibe, the atmosphere when you ran an event. It made the club feel so great. I mean, people came in, they watched some great tennis, they had a drink. It wasn't just about, as far as I was concerned, about the bottom, the dollar. I thought that, running events was good for a club, not just tournaments, round robins, leagues.
Right.
And so I was a proponent of that and running tournaments. And through running tournaments, I met a lot of the Canadian players.
Yeah. And that's kind of where I was going with this. I'm glad you brought up the fact that you were let's call it tournament centric, because as a player who was on the fringes of playing tournaments, I was like a first round casualty most of the time, but I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed the people that were in the tournaments. And I remember when I first started playing some of the senior tournaments that Mayfair ran, I just thought it was such a great thing. But beyond that, Mayfair also had some pretty high-level tournaments with some pro-level players, and I know you got to know some of the top Canadian players of that era as well through not only the tournaments at Mayfair, but you were part of that whole tennis tournament scene, like the Sun Life Nationals days and things like that. Talk a little bit about some of the players and some of the events.
Yeah, well, I ran a lot of the national events, the Tennis Canada, and that's where I got to know people like Gavin Ziv,
current president,
who was involved. I ran a lot of OTA tournaments, and got to know the people that were working at that time, and that was the Bob Woods and the Dennis Ings, the Jim Boyces, and then of course Kartik. So it's come full circle. I knowing the people that at the associations, and then of course the players. I knew a lot of the top Canadian players, the Glenn Michabatas, the Martin Wostenholmes, the Grant Connells, and we used to run this Bacardi tournament,
right?
That
back in the day when you could have a liquor sponsor.
Correct. But I got to know a lot of the players in those days. Of course, Dale Power played a lot of those tournaments, and we brought a lot of players in from the States as well. So I befriended players from Detroit. There was Ed Nagel, who used to keep coming back to my tournament. He said, the reason why I like coming to Mayfair? It's because you wash my clothes. He says after, he said, I didn't have enough, I played a few matches 2 in one day and I ran out of clothes. He said, well, Irwin, what should I do? I said, no, I'll put it in with the next towel order. So, that's what you went over and above. These guys came and played, and it wasn't for a lot of money. Yeah. The Bacardi, we might have had $15,000 prize money.
Right.
But these guys gave it all. The Stefan Bonots, they used to love coming to Mayfair in Toronto. And, even to this day, I see players and they'll come up to me and said, Irwin, you ran the best tournaments. And I'm not bragging, but I still hear that. And that was very appreciative. And it's great that I can still do it these days, and run, I'm heavily involved running the Steve Stevens Masters Tennis Championships now and look after the Masters tournaments. But a lot of these players that are playing in them now were juniors.
Yeah, I was going to allude to that, but you beat me to it. You have seen, young under 12s, under 14s, and probably some of them played and were coached at Mayfair clubs who went through the OTA junior system, and here they are 30, 40 years later playing in the provincial and national senior events or masters events. It's pretty cool. I mean, you've seen a lot of growth in sport.
Your tennis director at the OTA, he played under 12 events, Richard Manila.
Right.
And, he's tried to make a brief comeback in Masters tennis. Actually, he's done well. He hasn't played for a few years, but the last time the event was in Toronto, he did well. And you see so many of those players that used to play juniors, players like Coulter Wright, who's one of the top doubles players in Canada, who come and play the events. I've seen a lot of players through the years. I can relate one story about Carling Bassett.
Sure.
I saw Carling last year for the first time in close to 40 years. I actually hosted the first tournament that she played in Canada. Wow. It was an under 12 invitational event that I ran at Mayfair Valley. And she came and played. We had 8 players, and she was training at Bolletari's. And I knew her father, Johnny Bassett, because whenever they were in town, they would call me and see if they could book some courts. Don Fontana, who was an ex-Davis Cup player, was involved with her as well, and so that was the connection. I knew Don very well, And she came and played, and she wasn't an unknown player, but at 10 in an under 12 event, she wasn't the favorite. Her first match, she played Renee Simpson.
Oh my, okay.
And score was 6-love for Carling.
My goodness.
And so Renee got off the court. She was crying, and I didn't know, it was hard to handle. I handled the situation.
Right.
Carling, of course, went on to win the tournament and then went on to bigger things. But I'm saying I saw her last year. I hadn't seen her in 45 years. I'd gone out for dinner with a couple of friends, and they said, "You got to come. We're playing pickleball at this private court." And Carling Bassett is going to be one of the players.
Oh my gosh.
And so I went out and I watched. Adrian Simmons, who you might know, is Adrian Benoit's family, right, and was one of the players. And I had dinner with her that night. And so I came out and I watched Carling. And we reminisced because I hadn't seen her in 45 years, but she remembered that tournament.
That's amazing. Wow.
So, I mean,
indelible moment really for her. Because Renee was probably already quite well known as a U12 player, and like just to beat her that easily, because Renee went on obviously in a pretty good career of her own. So that's a cool story. This is what I think it must be. When you take the time to look back, it must be very rewarding to to have seen all these players, people like Glenn Michabata and others, to go on to greatness. Did you have any kids who were actually training at Mayfair who went on to be a notable pro?
Yeah, well, Andrew Schneider.
Oh yeah, of course, right.
Was he grew up at Mayfair. Adam Baranowski.
Oh yeah.
Played at Mayfair. Andrea Rabzak, who's involved and been involved all her life with tennis, trained at Mayfair. And we helped out kids over the years. Sharon Fitchman, right, played at Mayfair and trained under Ben Armstrong at the time.
Right.
And but you know what? It wasn't all about the top players.
Yeah.
We used to run a lot of Class A tournaments.
Right.
And one year, the Class A in the 70s was huge.
Yeah.
And we had a 256 draw.
Oh my goodness.
That's how popular tennis was.
Wow.
And this Class A was about a 4.5 to 5.0 level. And, we had to run it in. It was an outdoor event at Mayfair Valley, but we had to run it. We had to run the qualifying indoors because the event was that large. And I ran the Ontario closed event at Mayfair. Over the years, and we had different sponsors like Bata Shoes, I remember, was one of the sponsors.
Yeah, I saw some pictures.
And one story I'd like to relate that, and it wasn't really the top players, but we were running a Class B event, and that was for 3.5 players. And in those days, in the 70s, you just called in and they took your entry over the phone. And so it was a big tournament. It was a Friday night. I think it was a 64 draw. People were going to play 2 matches a day, and we were going to get through the tournament. And, I'm overseeing the tournament, and then the person who's at the desk comes up to me and says, "Irwin, we got a problem. There's 2 guys with the same name here, Brandon Smith. They're here to play this gentleman. What do I do?" So I thought about it, and I said, "Well, what do you do?" I said, "Well, you know what I figured out? Let them play each other." So they played each other, and they agreed. They said, mistakes happen, and of course Brandon Smith moved on. He ended up losing the next round, but it was one of the unusual stories that I had to relate.
Yeah, those days, it was a little. It's very much like mini pros now, or like everything is so regimented now and rules are so enforced. But it was a little bit of the Wild West back then. People just were a little more accepting of things, and it was just the start of this whole professional and sort of tournament era, so to speak. But that's a great story.
I just wanted to read a few other Mayfair anecdotes because being there for so many years. And we ran a lot of we ran singles parties Okay.
Now would that been at Mayfair Valley by any chance? Some of the big parties like that?
Yeah, we did have them at Mayfair Valley. We also ran them at Mayfair West, and we were running them once a week.
Oh wow!
And they would we'd run a tennis round robin.
Yeah.
And then if you just wanted to come after to socialize,
right,
we'd have a dance. And they were very popular. We used to run a lot of parties, club parties.
Right.
And I wanted to relate one story that happened a little later in my career at Mayfair. We were running a Halloween party
right
at Mayfair East. And, all the staff were there and, everybody dressed up. And that night I dressed up as a woman. Anyway, so I'm we're socializing, whatever. And of course, nature called. And I had to go to the washroom. So I go in to the men's washroom. And there's a guy next to me and he says, "Sir, you're in the wrong washroom." Anyways, we were beside each other in the urinal. So anyways, some funny stories that I just would like to happen over the years. It was a great club, Mayfair. I have no regrets all the time I spent there.
Right.
I loved the staff. The ownership was great. And it was great to be at Mayfair, and to this day I miss it. But it's the people, like I said, and the staff that I miss, and I still run into people.
Sure, of course, yeah. I mean, to your point, I felt in my time there as well that it was a corporate, a for-profit organization, but it felt like a community club. It really had a club feel about it, and it wasn't institutional, and so people became lifelong friends from meeting at places like that. And there's a few other clubs like that, like the old Waterside Club down in the Toronto Harbor area. It was the same kind of vibe, It was kind of the swinging 70s too, and 80s. It was kind of a different scene.
The Waterside Club was famous for their bar on the water.
That's right.
I remember many times coming down there after a league match, supporting our team and that was the
place to go.
That was the place. Yeah,
yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, we could probably spend a lot of time, given our vintage, of talking about that era, and it was one of my favorite years because that's when I grew up and started to love the game. But before I move on, when were you on the board of the OTA, the Ontario Tennis Association?
That was in the 80s.
Okay.
I worked with with the likes of Gus Stahl,
right,
and certain individuals that I worked very closely with. I was the tennis development person on the board. That was my role. And, there was a person by the name of Norm Bradwell,
right,
that also was involved. He was involved in running a lot of the Class A tournaments.
Yeah. In fact, he was on our first glossy cover of on the Ontario Tennis magazine, actually. So I know who you're talking about. So was your role to oversee like the competitive structure for the OTA, both adult and junior, or was it?
It wasn't really. It was the adult. It was the adult structure. I mean, I was involved. There was also a tennis pro. I'm not sure who it was at that time, but there was two of us that had the role of being people that worked at the clubs. Yeah. Our expertise was important to the people that were on the board. And, Mayfair had a great relationship with the OTA over the years.
For sure.
And, I basically was the person who developed it and created it. And, we ran a lot of events. Yeah. And not only tournaments, but if there's ever certification events. Yeah. And the other thing that we did at Mayfair was we ran a lot of the high school tournaments.
Oh, really? Like the OFSA?
The OFSA tournaments.
Oh, really? Okay.
And we would do it at off times, and a lot of the times the owners and the higher ups at Mayfair would say, well, why are you giving them such a good court rate? First of all, it's kids, it's students, but they're getting exposed to Mayfair.
Right.
And guess what? 20 years later, where are they going to join?
Yeah.
They were at Mayfair, and sure enough, I'd see people that come in and join 20 years later who said, that's how I found out about Mayfair. I played my high school tournament there. Yeah. So that's another way of, you want to expose people to your club. Yeah. People,
I think Mayfair in those days was quite instrumental, under your leadership of keeping winter tennis alive and giving people a place to compete and meet up players from other clubs and that sort of thing. I think, like, I remember even as a youngster, I played an OTA tournament under 8, under 16 or something, and it was pretty small and nobody knew anybody else. They were just coming from these different regions, but I think that era started the sort of whole community of tennis, the tennis tournament players knowing each other, and it became a really important focal point for the sport. And listen, after COVID, the clubs have just been so busy, and it's so difficult to find indoor clubs now to run events. Tell us about it.
And not only in Ontario, but it's happening everywhere.
Yeah,
and it's I'm hoping that we can build more courts.
Yeah, for sure.
The covered courts that we're putting up, it's expanding. Tennis Canada is working with the clubs, the provincial municipalities, and also the associations to get more clubs so people can play tennis and also compete, because it's very important. And that's why I felt that we wanted to be able to offer our courts so that we can develop the next Milos. Right. That was the goal. I grew up knowing all these guys, Dennis and Milos. I ran the first rookie tournament that Dennis Shapovalov played. It was an under 10 event at Mayfair East. Sorry, it was an under 12 event.
Right.
And I think he was 8 or 9. And his brother played in the event.
Oh, no kidding.
I don't know if you knew, but he had a brother. And, we used to have boxes at that point, and you win your box and you play in the final. Right. So they both won their boxes. And of course, Dennis played his older brother in the final. And I'm not going to have to tell you who won, but it wasn't pretty, beating your older brother. But of course, Dennis went on to much bigger and better things.
Yeah.
But, I'm just having the privilege to know the players and
see their growth,
and to see them grow. And listen, Milos played in a club tournament when he was a junior at Mayfair at the Valley. It wasn't the Valley. It wasn't Mayfair Valley anymore. It had changed ownership. But I saw his name on the draw. Where he was playing club players when he was 11, 12.
That's amazing.
And just to say that you've played him, somebody that became number 3 in the world.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, you've seen it all, really, and over the years. I would say that what I think you're best known for now is Masters tennis, seniors tennis. You've embraced that role. I mean, you've always been involved with seniors tennis, even back in the Mayfair days with the Wilson tournaments, which I think really put seniors tennis on the map. Frankly, you had the series throughout the winters for a number of years. And as you said, a lot of the people you saw as juniors were coming back, and people like Carl Hale, like Gary Mianchos were starting to play these tournaments as they, became senior players.
Yeah, it's funny. I got approached by Doug Coombs at Wilson.
Right.
It was in the early 2000s, and they had some sponsorship money that they wanted to, start something. I said to him, you know what I think we should do, Doug? I said, let's do an over 35 tournament, because at that time you had all these players, the Andrew Schneiders, the Chris Pridhams, the Mark Greenans, the Brian Draxels, Carl Hale, who became 35. I said, let's start an indoor circuit. Let's run 4 events. And let's not just do 35s. Let's do 35s, 45s, and maybe 55s. And let's start it. Let's call it the Wilson Mayfair Indoor Circuit.
Right.
Sure enough, we did it. We first year we might have had $10,000 prize money. We got the players out. And I think, Peter, you might have played in one of those.
I did. Yeah, it wasn't a bit of an ignominious moment, but yes, I did. I played a friend of mine, Bill Buckler, in the over 40s. And I remember seeing you there that day, and it didn't go so well for me, but I was still very much a fan of that whole circuit. And even when I wasn't playing, I'd come out and watch the finals on a Sunday and that sort of thing. And I overall really enjoyed the experience.
Yeah, we would get great crowds out watching, and it was great. It was great tennis.
It was actually.
And then there was prize money for 45 and 55-year-olds, and that was in those days. I mean, it was new, so it wasn't. They weren't getting what the over 35s were getting, but still. And then we started, men and women, when we were getting, even the Renee Simpsons were coming out to play, and the Julie Staples came out, and they started playing some of these tournaments. So it revived, and it got Masters tennis going, and it evolved into the ITF tournaments.
Right.
It wasn't an ITF tournament when we started it, but then we, what I've been able to do, we started that Mayfair tournament, and then we've now evolved to across Canada to, we're going to have 14 ITF tournaments next year.
14. Wow.
14 ITF tournaments spread across Halifax, Victoria, Edmonton, Calgary. We're running them everywhere. And in Quebec City, the big event that we run in Tremblant every year. So not only do we, we're trying to bring tournaments to regions across Canada, not just in the Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal hubs, but we're expanding Masters tennis. So that's, one of our priorities. And of course, the big event that we run each year is the Steve Stevens Senior Nationals. And I'm going to talk about Steve Stevens. I was going to ask you about that. I mean, you go way back with Steve. And for folks who don't know late Steve Stevens, he was a driving force. I'm going to let you tell more about his background, but he was a driving force in Canadian tennis, in particular seniors tennis, for many years. And I think he became a very good friend of yours, but I think he started out as a mentor. Yes, of course. So just going back, and I guess it was about 2005, there was some changes at Tennis Canada and in the committees, and Haddon McDaddy approached me and said to me, Irwin, do you want to come and, we need somebody to look after the Masters Committee. With your history running events and knowing all the players, we think that you're the perfect person. And, it's a volunteer position, but we'd love you to come and do it. So I said, sure, Haddam, tell me what it's all about. He said, well, there's going to be 4 meetings a year. There's one that's in person, and you'll be involved working with Steve Stevens. I said, well, I know Steve. Steve, just so you know, he was general manager of Toronto Lawn in the 80s, and was brought to Tennis Canada by Robert Bettauer to look after the senior program. It wasn't Masters in those days. It was the senior programs. So he started to run seniors tennis and started running some teams, and teams that world teams that Canada would go and compete against the other countries. And Steve started all that, and also, there was, the tournament that was being run. And eventually, they named it after Steve, and that was the National. So I got involved with that, and knowing all the players, they came to me about seedings, and
what can you do about a starting time, Irwin? I need.
Yeah, that happened many times, but I got to know Steve very well, and we battled. I was chair, and we'd have committee people from across Canada, and we battled. But you know what? I respected Steve. He was a gentleman that worked up until he was 98 years old. Yeah. He worked for Tennis Canada till tonight. He was doing Excel files at 98.
Impressive.
He was doing the rankings manually up until he got sick. And I got to know Steve very well. My wife and I actually befriended him. We looked after him in his final days.
Oh, wow.
So, not only was a mentor, I learned a lot from him, and he was just a great guy. And, Tennis Canada and the senior players, Masters players, owe a lot to Steve, because without Steve, Masters tennis wouldn't be where it's at today.
Yeah, and I think it's safe to say that you've sort of taken over that mantle, and I think you're doing an amazing job in sort of continuing his legacy and making. I know a number of the senior players that play in the events, but let's talk about this year's nationals. It was like nothing I've ever seen. The number of players, the number of clubs you had to, basically work with to get this thing done. Talk about, it's always been big, but this year was off.
Yeah, we had the biggest event this year, this past August in Toronto. And just to give you a little brief history, we rotate the event across Canada. Last year it was in Montreal, the year before Vancouver. We've been to Ottawa. We're hoping to go to Ottawa in the future. Next year it's scheduled in Vancouver. But this year it's in Toronto, and entries are coming along pretty nicely. And, we usually have, between 550. And last weekend, doing the entries and updating the file, and the entries closed on a Monday, and I'm seeing, we're at 575. And I said, oh no. We have 32 courts, and it's usually enough courts. The top clay court private clubs in Toronto, the Granite clubs, the Donalda, Toronto Lawn, Toronto Cricket Club, and I'm, we also, had Cottingham was going to help out. So we were in good shape. We had 5 clubs. Entries closed on the Monday. We had over 640 entries.
Oh man.
What are we going to do? So, knowing a lot of people in the city, I called up a few of the clubs and basically begged, I need courts. We didn't want to turn down any players. And, we ended up, the Boulevard Club helped us out. They weren't doing the provincials this year for various reasons. And then Credit Valley has become a great partner. They do an ITF tournament, said, what can we do to help you? And they were great. Petcha there helped us out, and Paul Cairns helped us out. So we were able to for the first few days, get it up to 40 courts. And without the help of those clubs, we couldn't have done it. So, I thank all the clubs in Toronto for stepping up and helping us and helping Masters Tennis and getting through the event. But it's come crossroads with this event. What are we going to do with it? It's become too large. It's a good thing.
Yeah.
But we're going to be in Vancouver, and obviously we're looking at maybe altering the format of the event. And there's a lot of
victim of your own success.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, so, and then obviously that's the sort of 5-star event for seniors in Canada, but you were also involved with Team Canada and the players that go and play in the ITF World Individual and Team Championships. Talk a little bit about that. And
so the way it works, Peter, is people they play these tournaments, and they they want to get a ranking.
Yes.
And if they get a ranking, they might get selected to compete on the teams, which I alluded that Steve started. And Steve started, we had 2 teams. We had an over 35 and an over 45 team. He developed women's teams with the help of Inga Weber and Muffy Grieve. He developed the women's teams. Now the men's teams always did really well with the Lauren Mains and the Ken Sinclairs. Mm-hmm. Lauren, the most decorated Masters player in the world.
Yes.
So we've developed some great players. So, now there's over 30 and there's over 85 teams. The over 85 World Championships team is the Lauren Main Cup. So it was named after Lauren, and that was quite an honor for Lauren.
Right.
We were hoping to do it while he was alive, but it subsequently came in a year after he passed away. Mm-hmm. So,
But it seems like you get a lot of support from the senior community out there. Like they know who to talk to when they need to know anything about seniors tennis. But you again show your passion for it, and I think you're very widely respected and loved by a lot of the players. I mean, you probably have arguments with a few, but by and large,
of course. And just recently, we won 2 medals this past year.
Yes.
And we won the medals in Turkey. Our over 75 team won the world championships, right. And that team consisted of Tim Griffin and Chris Burr and Joe Fourier, and then our over 70 team reached the finals and got a silver medal. So that's the first time that we've won. We reached 2 finals ever, and won 2 medals. That team was led by Keith Porter and Brian Miller. Keith Porter is a recent world champion, right, as well. Ken Dahl won a world championship. Of course, Muffy Grieve and Inga Weber are renowned for winning many world individual championships, because not only do they go over and they play the team event, they then go and stay on. A lot of the players will play the world individual championships. Right. And we've done really well winning some doubles events over the years. And there's just been many players that, have really put Canada on the map for Masters tennis.
It's interesting that there's a lot of names like the ones you just mentioned, sort of a bulge. And I think they were basically in their prime during the first boom of the tennis in the 70s and 80s and came through that. And so it's not surprising that in this era, in the older categories, there has been quite a few, prominent players from Canada. What about the sort of the younger generation, like the 45s and the 50s nowadays? Have you got some good prospects coming up?
Yes,
prospects. It's funny to say it that way, but you know what I mean.
Well, Henry Choi is the number 1 over 40 player in the world.
Okay.
He grew up in Hamilton, played. I knew Henry in the juniors, so we've done well. I guess I alluded to our older players, but and good point, Peter, bringing up our young and up and coming 30 and 35 players.
Right.
Just recently, Jeremy Langer won the over 30 nationals, and right. I remember him playing junior tennis,
of course,
not too long ago. Yeah. He was one of the top, and he's hoping to go represent Canada in actually this month in Japan.
Right.
We've got the over 45 for the first time in Asia. The World 45 Championships are happening. And
yes, I ran into Adam Baranowski, actually, and I think he's one of the players going, isn't he?
Adam, who grew up at Mayfair, is currently the head tennis pro at the London Hunt Club. He's our number 1 player on our over 45 men's team. So, and Canta Morelli is representing Ontario on our over 45 women's team. She's also the Ontario committee rep. Right. For the Tennis Canada Masters Committee, so she's captaining that team. We're hoping that there's actually 24 women's teams and 23 men's teams competing.
Well, so in the age of gender equity, you guys are more than holding your own then.
Yes, we're happy to say that.
Yeah, that's good. Well, it sounds like it's something that will continue to grow and thrive. And I think, as I said, I know a number of the players, and they seem to have their heart in the right place and want tennis, seniors or masters tennis to be bigger and better than ever. So, I applaud you and their efforts in keeping it on the radar.
Yeah, and we're trying to take it to a different level.
Yeah,
we've got some committees that are aiming to find some sponsorship and some donors, and to get some partners that will help elevate the Masters games, the Masters tournaments,
right,
and Masters tennis, and make our events better for the players. And we want to have physio at all our events.
Yeah.
And it's important to have, especially for Masters players. And one of the things I also want to bring up is, there are a number of players who, played, were excellent players, played on the circuit. And they come and they try their luck at playing Masters tennis, and it's not so easy. and sometimes they'll get defeated by players who are not so well known, but now train and work out. To give you one example, and he's also in Ontario. Somebody like Ben Wu,
right?
Who he was never a top player. He became a dentist, and of course his time and his parents, he needed to study, and he didn't have a chance to play as much tennis. But later on in life, he's dedicated himself to playing the Masters tournaments, playing on the teams, and has done quite well. And now it's Masters tennis isn't about the older players who you mentioned, right, but it's about the players who are the fittest, yes, and who train. And that's why we want to get physio really, right, involved with the Masters tennis. And then, of course, Ben's got a son that's now playing, right, and is doing well. Yeah, Braden. So it's come full circle
for sure. So, Irwin, you basically are walking encyclopedia of tennis in Canada, and particularly obviously in our market. And we hope that you continue for as many years as you can to stay involved. But what's your sort of outlook on the next 5 years, both not just for seniors tennis, which we've been talking about, but just the state of tennis in Canada, from your eyes right now? What's good about it, and what do you think we could do better? Well,
I think that Masters tennis it's never been more popular.
Right.
However, I think that we've got to find more facilities,
right,
to run the events. We just don't have enough clubs. So I think that's one of our challenges, and so I think that's important. I think that as players become older and perhaps cannot play tennis, there's pickleball, and it's as much as I'm a tennis guy through and through, and a pickleball is very important. It provides an opportunity for activity and social activity, and I don't look at pickleball as being a competitor of tennis. I think they can go hand in hand. As long as they're not too close to each other because of the noise. But I do think that we've got to work with the pickleball associations, and we've got to try to grow both sports. Right. I don't think fighting them is the answer. And
I think it's a real estate play. If there's enough grounds for tennis and pickleball, whether it's together or even separately, I think there will be peace in the valley. Yeah,
there will, and there's also another sport that's very popular, and that's padel.
Right,
and it's just coming into to Canada. It's very popular in Europe, and that's another sport that's a little more difficult than pickleball, but it's in between tennis and pickleball. Right. And I know people are enjoying that. So, but as far as Masters tennis goes, it's like I say, it's never been more popular. We've got more tournaments. We've got more people playing. But we've got to bring it to another level. We need the funding, and we're going after it as well. The funding and the facilities to run is crucial, and that's our biggest challenge as I see it.
Yeah. Now, you've heard it here, everybody. Irwin wants you club managers and owners to run some tournaments, and we wholeheartedly agree with him at the OTA. We do need more facilities to host tournaments, whether it's juniors, adults, seniors, etc. So thanks for putting that plug in there, because I think it's very important for the growth of the sport long term. I look at a country like Sweden, when Bjorn Borg came along, the whole country fell in love with the sport, and there was a whole generation of players from that country. And then it kind of dried up, and then the funding was lost now. And now you look at the professional level, and you don't see hardly any Swedish players. And I think, Canada has to look and say we've had a bit of a golden era lately, but we need to support it, not just, at the grassroots level, club level, juniors, and adults tournament right through to seniors. I think the whole ecosystem has to be healthy in order for us to continue to thrive.
I agree, and I've been on the both sides of it, both sides of the fence. Running a club, and now administrating tennis. And one thing I want to say to the club directors and owners is don't think short term, think long term, and what long term you're going to get out of running events.
Got it. Well, listen, Irwin, it's been a pleasure speaking with you about tennis in Ontario and Canada for the last hour. We could go on for many more hours. I would love to invite you back for another time to continue this kind of conversation, because I think it's important for younger players to know about the history so that they can, when it's their turn, they can continue to move the sport forward. And I think a lot of people in this country who play tennis owe you a debt of gratitude for your vision and for your passion for the sport. So thanks for sharing with us today, and keep up the good work.
Thank you, Peter. And anytime, I'd love to come back.